Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this Brexit briefing, implications of a hard and soft Brexit. We've got very many attendees, which is absolutely splendid, and thank you for joining us. But I fear also indicates just how much ambiguity and confusion there is about what is going to happen in March 2019, or indeed January 2021. And we will do our best to clarify what can be clarified. During the webinar, there will be some polls that we run, which would be great if you could participate in. And just to let you know, there's a disclaimer, GDPR friendly, that we may use the poll for marketing purposes, but you will remain anonymous. And at the very end of the webinar, there will be an opportunity to ask some questions. Okay, so the purpose of today's webinar is to obtain as much clarity as possible about the various Brexit types, be they hard or soft, clean or indeed dirty, and to look at the implications of those for VAT and customs. And my colleagues Rob Jannering and Andy Spencer will be looking at the detail of those from a technical perspective slightly later in the webinar. But before we get there, and in order to do that, I'm afraid there will necessarily be an overview of the politics of Brexit, and we'll be looking at some scenarios and their consequences. Okay, so firstly then, the political. So I've got the reasonably impossible task of describing the political algebra involved in getting to Brexit. And there are many elements to this, as I'm sure people are aware, but I'm going to be talking about the transition agreement issue, why the problem of the customs union has become the central question for Brexit, the customs union being debated today in the House of Commons, how political actors currently outside the negotiations might try to affect them, and how Brexit relates to the European Commission's VAT action plan agenda. So there's quite a bit of different stuff to have a look at. But the first thing that we need to talk about is the transition, because the transition is, or lack thereof, is the thing that's going to have an impact on people immediately. So why does a transition period matter? As it stands, if the European Union and the United Kingdom and the related entities like the European Parliament can agree on a high-level withdrawal agreement by the end of March 2019, everything will stay the same legislatively for the UK in relation to Europe until the end of at least 2020. That's the principle that we have now. And after that, there would be what Theresa May used to call an implementation period, but in reality is a transition period because much would still need to be negotiated. But the upshot would be that we could all sleep a bit easier in our beds for a couple of years. And the alternative to that, to the transition agreement, isn't very pleasant to contemplate. Without a transition agreement, the UK would, I mean, this is the principle of it, become a third country in April 2019, exporting and importing to and from the EU. There'd be tariff barriers, customs checks, import VAT, and lorry queues as far as the eye can see. Well, that's the theory at any rate. In the best case, the cliff edge, as it's called, might be mitigated by a temporary bridge to a new World Trade Organization governed framework. But either way, change would be colossal and it would be rapid. There could be legal uncertainty and huge compliance risk. So they won't let it happen, will they? They can't let it happen. What could be significant enough to risk the kind of economic crash that could follow a failure to achieve a transition agreement? And unfortunately, there is an answer to this, and the answer is peace in Ireland. A porous soft border between Northern and Southern Ireland for people and goods is a central feature of the arrangements that came out of the Good Friday Agreement. And the UK government has committed, understandably, to retaining that soft border. The problem with that is that on the face of it, doing so implies the creation of a new sea border between the UK and Ireland, because otherwise nothing has changed and no control has been taken back. But the UK government has also committed to maintaining the integrity of the UK as currently constituted, i.e. there being no sea border, and as actually came out in the press this morning, they'll be held to that by the Democratic Unionist Party, who absolutely are against the principle of there being a different regime for Northern Ireland to the rest of the United Kingdom. Okay, so this is the reason that the customs union is becoming the focus of all of the angst, and it's going to be, you know, the specifics of this Andy's going to talk about a bit later. But what's the UK's response been to this problem? Well, essentially, until now, it's been to say that the problem doesn't exist. The UK's line in negotiation, there was a proposal that was put to the Commission not long ago, was that technology can monitor what needs to be monitored at the border. And you may remember the Foreign Secretary using the notorious analogy of London's congestion charge. The EU denies that such a technology that could safely manage the border has been developed, and maintains that there are risks to financial security, such as duties not being collected, and more importantly, because the scheme would not really be frictionless, a risk to physical security as well. And the real fear is that infrastructure is put up at the border in some way, and that nationalists who look at this as a de facto separation of parts of Ireland attack the border infrastructure. So in essence, the European Union believes that Northern Ireland and the UK should remain in a customs union with Europe, and that's of course the position of the Irish government. So why not do that? Why not just go with that? So apart from the pure sovereignty issue, the customs union is of course crucial to long-term trade policy, and this is again a major divide between political viewpoints. So Remainers have tended to believe in the gravity model of trade, and the gravity model says that you will always be able to trade more effectively with countries closer to you. It's crucial for supply chains in the gravity model that things are as frictionless as possible, and it makes absolutely no sense to erect obstacles to trading with close partners because they're the people that you can do the most trade with. And hence the logic of the position is that we should absolutely stay within a customs union with Europe. For Brexiteers, that may have been true once, but they believe that technology is changing everything, and so that these questions about supply chains need to be phrased differently. They also point out that it is expected that the lion's share of global growth in the next decades will be outside of the European Union. They make the point that inside a customs union we can't negotiate trade deals, and indeed a customs union makes Brexit pointless, or as Andrea Leadsom I think said earlier today, the worst of all possible worlds. That is, to leave the EU but to maintain a customs union with it. So as you can see, this is a real standoff. Are there alternatives? Well, one of the things that was talked about in the early days was the European Economic Area, and actually the current favourite, it seems, of liberal Brexiteers, the current favourite model is the relationship with Switzerland. There's a soft border between Switzerland and the European Union. Switzerland can negotiate its own trade deals and so on. But the problem is that Switzerland also accepted freedom of movement with the European Union. And taking back control of immigration was absolutely critical to the Leave campaign during the UK referendum. And this gets to the heart of the dilemmas, because the winners, the leaders of the Leave campaign, not Farage, but the other leaders, Johnson, Gove, Daniel Hannan and so on, are economic liberals, and they are not interested in limiting immigration. But they won the vote by promising to do just that, and that has created a major problem. And the consequence of all of this is that there's absolutely no guarantee of a transition deal. So, and this brings us to the first of our poll questions. We're curious to know, does your business have a contingency plan for there being no transition agreement? And that's just coming up on your screen now. and we're just collecting some responses. Okay, so if I'll just give you 5 or 10 more seconds. Right, okay, that's very, very interesting. So yeah, so quite a lot of people still thinking about whether to look at the transition agreement at all. Some people haven't looked at it yet. That's interesting. Well, I think what perhaps will follow from this is that you ought to think about it a little bit as we approach March next year. Okay, but I think Rob and Andy will be able to explain the detail of why. So some Brexiteers would just accuse me of scaremongering on the basis of what I've just said, because one of the deeply held beliefs of the Brexiteers is that when push comes to shove, other EU member states will override the European Commission and force a deal, because it's not in their interest to allow the whole situation to fall apart. And what by member states, what Brexiteers mean is that Germany will step in so that there are no tariff barriers, particularly for German automotive manufacturers, because it could have such a massive effect on German prosperity and indeed employment. And this is something that, you know, I'm sure everybody's heard this. So will that happen? Is this the way that we resolve the problem? The answer is possibly. It's not impossible that that will happen, but you know, if we look at the last time that the UK depended on Germany riding to the rescue in this way, it was when David Cameron, during negotiations before the referendum, put his trust that Angela Merkel would come in and do something for him to do with benefits, actually, so that he would be able to go back to the UK with the famous break on immigration. Now, that didn't happen, and it would have been in Germany's interest, given what happened in the end with the UK leaving, for her to have intervened then. So there's a pretty strong counterexample straight away. There's also what's going on in the EU more generally, and people will know that President Macron of France has a very aggressive harmonization agenda. He believes that sovereignty should apply at the European rather than the national level. He thinks it's essential for the European polity that happens. On the other side, you also have what's going on with the East European countries and indeed in Italy, who are currently trying to separate themselves from EU policy, particularly in respect of immigration. Sorry, with Italy, the recent election, there are the parties that have done very well are parties that would like to pull away from the EU's immigration policy. Now, the problem then for the member states is if they ride to the UK's rescue and do a special deal for the UK that gives it exactly what it wants, is that it risks the disintegration of the EU project, because everybody else will want their particular issue to be prioritized. And I think this is the reason that Merkel has resisted stepping in. I think it's why she resisted stepping in at the time of the referendum. It's too risky. And this is something I think the Brexiteers haven't quite understood. They look at it purely as a matter of economic interest rather than the long-term political solidity of the European Union. So if the member states aren't going to come to the rescue, is there anybody else that could? Well, people will know Jeremy Corbyn did far better with the Labour Party in the last general election than was anticipated. It's conceivable, given what's going on with in the Conservative Party at the moment, that we could have a change of government before Brexit. The Brexiteers are deeply unhappy with what Theresa May seems to be proposing. There's a lot of resistance on the other side of the Tory party as well. Could there be a revolt? Could there be a general election? And if so, what would happen if Jeremy Corbyn was to come in? Here he comes, swooping in. Well, he said under some pressure that he would keep Labour in a customs union with the EU. So that would sort of solve one of the problems. But interestingly, Corbyn is really, he's a deep Eurosceptic, and in particular, he fears the consequences of the EU state aid rules for the Labour agenda, particularly around nationalisation. I mean, he sees the EU as a capitalist club, and you know, he's a person with a long history of being in the Bennite tendency of the party and so on. So it would be complicated and might not lead to the resolution of all the problems that we've been looking at. And at the heart of this, in British politics, you have a situation where Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-EU person who has to pretend to want to remain in the EU, whereas Theresa May is a Remainer who has to pretend to want to leave. And these ambiguities just make coming to any kind of real deal far more complicated. So, yeah. Sorry, we're just coming on to the last bit of this part of the presentation. What about what's going on in Europe and European VAT? Because, you know, of course, the European Commission has got its own plans for the tax, irrespective of what the UK does, and what effect will Brexit have on that. So the European plan is the VAT action plan. It's got many components to it, but I suppose the most important are a one-stop shop for distance sales, which is supposed to cut the cost of compliance for e-commerce. There's going to be potentially an increase for member states in the flexibility of rate setting, and overarching all of this, a new definitive destination-based system for VAT in Europe, which might take a few years longer, but it would move on from the current provisional arrangement, and is again based on a one-stop shop system. And what that a one-stop shop would mean is tax authorities cooperating with each other very, very closely, indeed collecting money on one another's behalf within the EU. Now, the UK has historically been extremely sceptical about VAT harmonisation of that type, and it's vetoed many proposals. I think the standard VAT return is one recently which the UK pushed back against. One interesting effect of the way the politics has gone is that were there to be a transition arrangement with the UK as a rule taker, it would have no such power. So it may, in the end, have to go along with a scheme as a rule taker that it would have had the power to reject had we stayed within the EU. And this begs a lot of questions. And indeed, the the UK Parliament's EU Scrutiny Committee has done an analysis recently of, you know, what could possibly happen to the UK in terms of VAT and Brexit. And the gist of it is that they can't quite work out what the UK's government strategy is. And their hypothesis was that the government intends for the UK to stay in the VAT area or to be extremely closely aligned to it, which again begs the whole question of why we're doing this, because it replicates the customs union problem. So, okay. Okay, so right, that brings me to the end of the political scenario. I hope that you can see that it's quite complicated. Rob now is going to talk about the more precise technical implications from a VAT perspective of hard and soft Brexit.
Right, thank you very much for that, Nick, most appreciated. So yeah, as Nick said, we're now going to move on and look at more the technical side of VAT. So some comments about what the impact is likely to be, depending whether we have a hard or a soft Brexit, and the differing implications that can have for businesses. So we'll start by going through that. So good place to start is probably what the current VAT rules are. So as it stands at the moment, the UK is still a member of the EU member states, and that means that it's beholden to the EU VAT directive that sets out the legal position for VAT across the whole of the EU jurisdiction. And how that works is that we have a European directive with the law, but then each individual member state adopts this into its own national legislation. So, for example, in the UK, we've got the VAT Act of 1994, and that's interpreted the VAT directive into our national legislation. Now, it's important to be aware of that because where each different member state interprets the rules, there can end up being differences in the national legislation. So although there's an overriding VAT directive, there are different rules in different countries. So for example, countries have, they're able to set different filing obligations. So that's why you see only 9 boxes on a UK VAT return, but over 60 on Italian VAT returns. There can be different interpretations in different countries as to what the characteristics of a supply might be. And there also, the EU VAT directive contains many may clauses. So that gives countries the options to actually bring rules into their countries or not adopt them. So for example, the option to tax for property, but I believe Belgium's in the process of just adopting that at the moment. So tax could be charged on property transactions. So there is one overriding EU VAT directive, but you can have 28 different interpretations of it across the EU. But it's worth remembering that the VAT directive does, in effect, have direct effect on everybody and is the ultimately binding piece of legislation. Now, that's important to bear in mind because as VAT is a European tax, that means that the ultimate arbitrator of any disputes between taxpayers and tax authorities is the European Court of Justice. And obviously, as Nick's alluded to, the European Court of Justice is very much a red line for the current government's Brexit strategy. So in effect, we want to have sovereignty within the UK, and we can't have sovereignty within the UK if we are being governed by the European Court of Justice. So what does that mean for VAT? Well, in effect, it means that a hard Brexit is maybe the most realistic prospect for VAT purposes at the moment, because if we carry on in the current model, we would have to rely on the ECJ. So what does hard Brexit mean for VAT purposes? Well, what it would basically mean is that the UK would no longer be a member state, and instead it would be a third country. And that is really significant because the EU VAT directive refers throughout to supplies between member states or third countries. And there are lots of consequences we go into depending on the status that the UK has after that. Obviously, a hard Brexit would be a worst case scenario, many people would say. And it's very possible we could have a soft Brexit and the final position is somewhere in between where we are at the moment and the hard Brexit. But as it stands, no one quite knows where that might be. So what we're going to do is just go through some of the different consequences and situations we might see. But before we do that, we've just got a quick poll question we want to ask you all. And this question is, should be coming up now. Have you considered how Brexit might impact your VAT position? So we'll give this 30 or so seconds, just to give you a moment to vote. So quite a lot of you voting, which is really great. Great stuff. Okay, I'll just close that. And so the results on that, very interesting. So 15% of you have got a plan in place, which is great to hear. You've obviously given it some thought and looked into it. 11% have no plan at all, but a really good 74% of people have given it some consideration, but no strategic plan at the moment. And that might be because there's a lack of certainty or something like that. But hopefully what we're going to go through now will give you some guidance and help to start forming some plans that we've got. So what's the current state of play in terms of Brexit and transitioning, and where we're going to stand and what's going to happen? So as Nick said, the intention is that Brexit should happen at the end of March next year. But what the UK would like is the transitional period, which basically allows businesses to get ready for Brexit when it happens a little bit in the future. So I think at the end of March, there was a draft agreement published, which was basically setting out the UK's withdrawal from the EU. And that was a really long document setting out how the transitional period will work between the UK and between the EU. Now, we've had a look at that document, and it's worth saying now that there are a number of colour coding situations in that document to give you a guide as to how agreed the situations were between the EU and the UK negotiators. But what it did say at Article 122 was that while the transitional arrangement is in place, all of the EU directives will continue to have effect in the UK. And that's important because it means the EU VAT directive we just talked about will continue to have direct effect into the UK. And that's good because it gives businesses certainty for that transitional period that the rules we currently have will continue to be the same rules. The transitional agreement also talked about at Article 47 that any goods that are going to be dispatched or transported into the UK to the member states or from the member states to the UK will still be subject to acquisition tax during that period, and we'll come on to talk about what that means. But that was, again, more reassurance that we've got. And I was talking about the colour coding, so saying that EU directives will continue, that was highlighted in green, which means it's been agreed at the negotiator level and should fall into the transitional document. The VAT bit for the transactions for goods was in yellow, which means the negotiators agreed on the policy, but it might be subject to some clarifications after that. But we will wait to see what happens. But obviously the thing is, this is the transitional agreement. Beyond that, we don't know what the arrangement will look like because we will be into Brexit. So this will maybe tidy us over for a little bit, but after that, it's still a lot of uncertainty. So obviously the poll, a lot of you have considered what to do, but no strategic plan. So how do you go about managing Brexit? Because it's a tricky situation with not a lot of certainty. So as Nick said, it's very difficult to predict what the final landscape is going to be in Europe. There are lots of moving parts, lots of variables to consider in that situation. What it's worth saying is that transitional agreement that's been set out in the withdrawal proposal, both the UK and the EU do need to agree to that agreement. And that means it needs to be ratified by both the Parliament in the EU and in the UK. So although there is this document that gives us some certainty towards the end of 2020, as it stands, it still needs to be ratified by both parliaments. And if that doesn't happen, we get closer to the cliff edge scenario of crashing out at the end of March 2019. The other thing to think about is that any new trade agreement to replace the current arrangements that we have with the EU still needs to be agreed, and that is still at negotiation level. I think the plan, and this is just my thoughts, is that should be in place when we enter a transitional agreement. So then from the start of 2021, everybody knows what the situation will be and they have 21 months to get their acts together and be prepared. But given we don't even know the transitional agreement will be in place, what the trade agreement will be or when that's going to be sorted out is very difficult to determine at the moment. So on that basis and taking it all into account, probably the best way to look at manage Brexit changes is to, with any degree of certainty, is to envisage that a hard Brexit might happen. And that might seem pessimistic, but it is the only set scenario that you can really give yourself something to work with, because if it's anywhere else in between, that could take any kind of form, and the number of variables are so large. So although it's one of the many points to review about Brexit and what it will end up doing, what we're going to look at over the next few slides is what a hard Brexit scenario would look like. And obviously there are many points to review about this, like we said at the bottom point, but what it's worth remembering as well is that VAT does impact every transaction that a business is involved with, and hence we don't know what Brexit is going to look like, but for businesses who haven't started to undertake some work on this, there probably will be benefits from doing a review of VAT anyhow, not just putting themselves in a better place for Brexit, but just for the general day-to-day management of their business. So having just talked about we don't really know what's going to happen and what the situation will be like for a hard Brexit, there are a few things we can say about what will stay the same, regardless of what Brexit looks like. So the first thing is any supply chains that are taking place, they're going to take place within the EU 27, as it would be after Brexit. They will remain subject to the existing rules. So if you are a UK business buying or selling on the continent, you will still have to remain VAT registered if you are already, or if you start new trade agreements, you will have to look at the EU VAT directive rules and the rules as put into each different national member states. And so that's really important actually to keep in mind. As Nick said, there are a number of proposals coming through on the VAT action plan. And so UK businesses won't be immune from them if they are trading into the EU, which a large number of them do. So if there is, that's one thing we do have certainty on, we're going to have to keep a track of the one-stop shops, the need for maybe a certified taxable person, the change to the destination process for accounting for VAT. There's lots scheduled to maybe change over the next 5 or 6 years, and that will still need to be managed by UK businesses. The key supply chains that will be impacted by Brexit will be those where the trade is going cross-border from the UK to the EU and vice versa. And there are a number of things we'll talk about there, and they mainly impact goods. The one other thing we can say that will stay the same or be very, very similar will be supplies of services. And this is because these are intangible transactions that take place, and generally they are taxed at the place of where the customer belongs when you've got B2B trades taking place. And the general rule across the EU is that the obligation to account for VAT on services sits in the majority of situations with the recipient. So if a UK business supplies accounting services to a French one, the French business accounts for the French VAT and vice versa on that. The expectation is that the UK VAT laws wouldn't dramatically change in the years preceding Brexit, and so we could have some certainty that services would continue to be the same, and still UK businesses and EU businesses benefit from not having to register in the other countries where they are. Of course, that may start to change and the rules start to diverge over the years, but we'll just have to watch what happens on that front. So, thinking about how to best manage Brexit. So, probably the key thing to say, and what we're already talking to businesses about, is knowing what your business's supply chains are is vital, because VAT is a transactional tax. It applies to every sale that you make and to every purchase that you buy. And so knowing the VAT implications for each one of those is vital. And these do often change. And what we normally see is a sales team have a different format of producing their sale to the customer. That doesn't get communicated to the tax team, and the tax team then apply the wrong VAT treatment to the transaction. And if you've got lots and lots of transactions happening all at the same time, that can build up very, very quickly to the wrong VAT treatment being applied and liabilities being owed to tax authorities or VAT not being recovered on costs. So the first thing to do is really look at your supply chains, know what they all are, map them out. Where are your customers based? Where are your suppliers moving their goods from or their services, and just know what's happening. So if a transitional agreement isn't put in place and we do have a cliff edge on the 29th of March, then you're in a good place to be able to make changes quickly without having to reaffirm all of those things. And the businesses that do those actions are probably going to have a head start. And, I think it's very easy. We can acknowledge that there might be no change and some of the work being put into that might not be beneficial in terms of a Brexit. But I think just knowing your supply chains, knowing your customers is always a good position to be in. And probably the last thing to say is another benefit is that even if you don't need to enjoy any of the work you do for Brexit, some benefits might be found as part of that, such as input tax not being recovered or VAT over declared. So let's look at the first difference there would be under a hard Brexit. So import VAT. So if the UK became a third country, then any goods arriving into the UK from the EU would no longer be acquisitions, and instead they would be imports. And the key difference that would mean is that acquisition tax would no longer be payable by UK businesses. So acquisition tax, just to clarify, is a tax when the goods arrive in the UK, the recipient acts as if it both buys and sells the goods. So it declares output tax, known as acquisition tax, and it gets to recover that acquisition tax on its VAT return. Normally they net off against each other, but it's an important accounting system. And what would happen instead is that we'd have import VAT becoming payable. And this is really important because the acquisition tax is a self-declared tax. And that means there's no cash flow impact because the output tax and the input tax offset. When you get import VAT in the UK as it currently stands, you have to pay that up front to release your goods from customs into free circulation, or you have to pay it via a deferment account. And that works in the fact that all of the import VAT you incur during the course of a calendar month, you then pay for it on a direct debit on the 15th day of the following month. So what that means is you get a little bit of respite, but not too much. And the big thing is you can't recover that import VAT for potentially several months down the line because you have to wait for a C79 certificate to prove the import VAT. You have to put it in the VAT return, and then you have to wait for HMRC to repay it. So going from acquisition tax, where there's no cash flow hit, you then go to import VAT, where there's an immediate cash flow hit that businesses will have to find. Some countries in the EU do allow for import VAT to be accounted for on the VAT return. For instance, Poland, France, Portugal, and Holland are good examples. And that means it works in the same way as acquisition tax. At the moment, though, the UK has said that there is no intention to have such a system in place. So from the start of April next year, potentially any goods coming into the UK, businesses are going to have to find cash to pay for that import VAT up front. So cash flow management is going to be the first situation to look at. What's next? Fiscal representation. So as we talked about, the EU rules will continue to exist after Brexit, whatever it looks like for the EU 27. Now, many EU member states, when a non-EU business registers for VAT in that country, they require them to be fiscally representative. And, the UK doesn't do this at the moment, and nor does Germany, but we do see it in a number of different countries. And what does that mean? It means that the tax authority in that EU member state wants a local business to take on joint and several liability for the non-EU business who's registered. And they do that because it's a non-EU business. And so if they get registered and they don't cover all of their duties, they pay their VAT, then they've got someone they can go to in the country to get the debts from. Now, on the surface, that doesn't seem too bad a position, but it's got some unintended consequences, which are that to have a local representative, a fiscal representative, the fees for doing that are generally higher because that person is taking on a large degree of risk on behalf of the other business. The second thing is there are only a finite number of businesses who do fiscal representation, so finding one is difficult. And if there is a Brexit and there's a sudden rush for more of them, that could exacerbate the situation. And on top of that, many of them, in addition to charging increased fees, they also ask for guarantee payments to be made. And that can take the form of an insurance contract, an agreement with the bank, or sometimes they want cash paid into an accrual account. So businesses have to think about this. Now, at this stage, it's not clear how UK companies would be treated in the event of Brexit. The hope is that other EU member states would say, well, they're from the UK, they've got a good reputation, we can trust them, but we just don't know if that will be the situation. And likewise for EU member states, businesses there, will the UK make a requirement for fiscal representative needed for EU member states? At the moment, the UK doesn't do that, but we just can't foresee into the future. So definitely something to think about for UK businesses with existing EU VAT registrations. Will there be a need to change the status of those and invest further money into it, tied up in guarantees and administrative costs? Obviously, talking about the need for EU VAT registrations, the EU VAT directive does have some good points about it in that it applies simplifications to help avoid registrations, which is good for businesses because it lowers costs, and it's good for tax administrations because they've got less companies to manage. Triangulation is probably the most common seen simplification in the EU when we've got goods moving. And so this works when you've got 3 companies in 3 different countries, and you have company A sells to B, and they're in 2 different countries. The goods move from country A to country C. So in this situation, France to Germany. And then the intermediary sells onwards to company C. So that's triangulation and what the supply chain looks like. What's really good about triangulation is that it relieves businesses from having to register. So without triangulation, in the scenario we just looked at, company B, I'll go back and I'll put it on the screen so people can see it. Company B in the UK would potentially have to register for VAT in France or in Germany. What triangulation does is relieve it of that need by letting company A use company B's UK VAT number, and then company C accounts for acquisition tax when the goods arrive in that country. Now, if the UK leaves the EU, then UK VAT numbers won't be able to be used in triangulation arrangements. And that means businesses then might have to register in different EU member states, and you get into a situation of chain transactions where registration might be needed in country A or country C to account for VAT at the right time. And on top of that, if triangulation goes, and this applies to all new transactions that might have to take place, ERP systems in accountancy packages will need to be remapped and retested to make sure the right tax treatment is applied to transactions and the right reports can be sourced to enable businesses to report correctly. So hopefully there will be an arrangement where something similar could be done, but it's got to be bear in mind that this could see more EU VAT registrations needed for UK businesses. EC sales lists and intrastats. So these are both reports that involve declaring to the tax authorities transactions that take place between businesses in 2 different EU member states. So EC sales lists record the VAT number of the counterparty to the transaction, and intrastats are all about recording how goods have moved around Europe. Now, if the UK was no longer an EU member state, then it is very likely that the UK will no longer ask for EC sales lists, because that data is shared amongst all of the EU member states. And if we're not a member state, we don't know what the interaction will be between the different tax authorities. The same goes for Intrastat as well, in that depending on our final arrangement with the EU, we might not be asked to share the data of goods going from the UK to the EU anymore, and hence would be no longer to do it. And that will work vice versa for goods coming from the EU to the UK. Obviously, the obligation will still be there for businesses trading intra-EU for the EU 27, and also the UK government might ask for equivalent reports to be submitted, because they still want to understand about the data and the movements of goods and our trading relationship with the EU. So that really will be a wait and see situation. And then finally, the last key situation to think about really will be VAT recovery, specifically where VAT's incurred in other EU member states and it's recovered at the moment via the refund directive claim. So the refund directive claim is where a UK business, say, incurs French VAT and it can recover it via the HMRC portal, and HMRC help liaise with the reclaim to the French tax authority. Businesses outside of the EU can't use this method, and instead they have to use what we call the 13th directive claim. And this could have a number of implications if the UK businesses have to start making 13th directive claims, because there are a number of basically harder hurdles to get over in order to have a successful claim. The first one is reciprocal rights, and this means that some EU countries will only repay VAT to businesses from countries that also repay VAT to theirs. So, for example, Spain does not make payments to US businesses because USA does not have a VAT system and they don't see there being any reciprocal rights there. So you would hope the UK and the EU have reciprocal rights, but again, there's a large uncertainty there. The second thing would be about invoicing. Under the current recovery method, invoices can be uploaded into a digital system, so PDF'd, and they can be shared amongst tax authorities. Or in some situations, you don't even have to share the invoices, just list out what you're recovering. Under the 13th directive method, originals need to be provided to tax authorities. They actually have to be packaged up and shipped so they can be verified by the different tax authorities. Obviously, how businesses store their records is very digital. And so that means being able to actually find where your records are stored, making sure the right people are storing them and not destroying them because they've got PDF copies, becomes vital in order to keep recovering VAT. And then probably the final thing is timeframes and deadlines. So at the moment, under the refund directive, you get 9 months to make a claim, but under the 13th directive, you only get 6 months to make a claim. So the time pressure is on. So those are the situations we're going to talk about for VAT. Just before I hand you over to Andy Spencer to talk about customs, just got one more question for you on VAT. So I'll launch this now. And the question is, which of the consequences we've just talked about do you think are most important for your business? I'll just leave this open for a little bit while everybody votes. Okay, I'll just close it off. There we go. So, clear winner was supply chains is the biggest concern for businesses there that we've talked about. Closely followed by the import VAT and the cash flow, and then the fiscal representative as well. VAT recovery is the lowest at 9%, but I think what this shows is there's a good share amongst all of the businesses of all of the consequences are going to be important for them and they all need to be managed. So thank you for that. I will now pass on to Andy Spencer to talk to you about customs.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how customs might work going forwards. Nick's already talked about the importance of the customs union and the high profile that it's got at the moment. So if we start with the current position and where we are at the moment. So as we said, there's a EU customs union, which the UK are part of, and that's made up of the 28 member states, as well as Monaco. It's important to recognise that there are other customs unions that the EU has. For example, it's got one with Turkey, but they're not the same as the EU customs union, as they vary in scope and the types of goods that are covered. Nick mentioned the European Economic Area earlier, so that's Norway, Liechtenstein and Iceland. So that gives access to the single market, but it's not a customs union. And equally, Switzerland, it's got access to the single market. It's not in the EEA or the EU, but it's not a customs union either. So the customs union at the moment gives the UK all the benefits that we're going to talk about now. So the way that it works is that suppliers in third countries, any goods that they supply into the EU are subject to a common external tariff. And what that means is that no matter which member state the goods go into, they're going to be subject to the same rate of duty. So if there's no duty, it would be the same everywhere. If it's 10%, it would be the same everywhere. So that's one of the conditions that have to apply within the EU customs union. So the customs tariffs are essentially collected centrally. So they're not it's an EU tax rather than a local country tax. The amounts of tax that are collected, there was 25 billion euros collected throughout the EU on the latest figures. 4.1 billion of that was collected in the UK. And to show it's an EU tax, 20 billion is transferred to the EU budget. So it's a source of funding how the EU works. The key thing with the customs union is that once the goods are in the union, any sales within the union are tariff free. So we talk about goods being within free circulation. So what that means is that if they initially imported into France, they then move to any other member state, there's going to be no additional customs tariffs. But the key thing as well is that free circulation means that they're not going to be subject to any more customs checks or any more customs documentation. So they can move freely within the EU as if it was one country. The other aspect of the EU customs union is that in relation to free trade agreements, and Nick mentioned this, members of the customs union can't negotiate their own free trade agreements. They're collectively agreed by the EU on behalf of all of its members. So just a little bit about free trade agreements. So they're not the same as the customs union, and it's quite important to recognise that. So free trade agreements, tariffs are reduced. They can sometimes be eliminated, but they don't mean that goods flow. They're not in free circulation, so they don't flow without any checks taking place. So the EU has got a number of free trade agreements. So it agreed one with Mexico earlier this month. That took nearly 2 years to agree. There's also the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with CETA, which is agreed with Canada, which is provisionally in place as of September 17, subject to be ratified in member states. Interestingly, that took 7 years to agree, but was many, many more years in the forming. There's also trade agreements imminent with Japan and Singapore. They've been agreed in principle, but they need to be finalised and put into place. So the EU has got a lot of existing trade agreements, which it's negotiated on behalf of all of the member states. So that's the current position. Goods come in, subject to the same tariffs, circulate freely within the EU, subject to no additional tariffs. So the position that the UK wants to move to is something which is essentially the same. So they want something which the government has called free and frictionless trade. So what they want is to have no VAT. Rob's just spoken about the consequences of VAT being imposed on cross-border movements within the EU. So it's an important issue because it's a significant amount of cash. So having to manage that additional cash, which you haven't at the moment, is going to put additional burdens on businesses. The key aspect is also no customs duty. So VAT, the principle is it shouldn't be a cost to a business as long as it's fully taxable, so it can recover the VAT. The question is just going to be when. But customs duty is a cost. You can't recover customs duty, so it becomes an additional cost to the business of trading in those particular goods. There are reliefs, so subject to what you're doing with the goods, you might be able to gain some relief. So for example, if they're not going to stay in the country after they've been imported, you might be able to use a warehouse or inward processing relief, but those have got an administrative cost in applying them. So customs duty is a real issue. The other point as well is no declarations or checks. So at the moment, once you import the goods, you have to do Intrastat, you have to do EC sales list, but you don't need to submit a new customs declaration, and goods won't be subject to any checks once they've left the UK. So that's what the UK wants to be able to achieve. But it also wants to be able to negotiate free trade agreements with third countries, because that's the whole point, as Nick said, of Brexit, is being able to enter into new agreements with countries outside the EU in order to boost trade and allow the UK to do things which is prevented from doing at the moment. One of the issues with this is that goods which are coming into the EU from those third countries are still going to be subject to the common external tariff. So we've talked about that a moment ago. All goods will be subject to the same rate of customs duty if they come into the EU. But the UK could set a tariff which is lower than the common external tariff. So goods will come into the UK. If there's no customs duty, no VAT, no declarations or checks, with goods moving between the UK and the customs union, that's going to present a significant problem, because goods are going to come into the EU and be subject to a lower duty rate via the UK than if they came in directly into a member state. So that's one of the significant problems that the EU would see with having agreements which are outside of the customs union. So the UK has put forward a number of proposals. It produced a paper called Future Customs Arrangements, a future partnership paper, which Nick's mentioned. So it's talked about a new customs partnership, which is aligning our approach to the customs borders in a way that removes the need for a UK-EU customs border. So essentially, this is the holy grail. This is what they want to achieve. So we've left, but it's essentially like we haven't left at all. So that would mean the UK mirrors the EU's requirements for imports from the rest of the world, and it's accepted that this is unprecedented as an approach and could be challenging to implement. So it's one of the options. The other option is a highly streamlined customs arrangement. So that's looking to streamline and simplify the requirements as much as possible on EU trade. So it's looking to put in place technology-based solutions to make it easier to comply with customs procedures, and it's using some of the UK's existing tried and trusted processes for UK and EU trade. Both of them are extremely challenging. The EU has said that the new customs partnership proposed wouldn't solve the Northern Ireland problems. And they've also said that they consider that the highly streamlined arrangement is considered to be a list of best practice measures. So at the moment, it's difficult to see how the UK's proposals are going to be acceptable to the EU. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a poll. So if we just launch that. So the question is, do you think the UK will form a customs union with the EU? As we said, that's being debated in Parliament this afternoon. So if you could just vote on that, please. It will be really interesting to see what the answer to this is. Okay, just wait a couple more moments. I imagine a few of you are tossing coins as we speak. Okay, if we close it now. Okay, so we've got 32% saying yes, 37% saying no, and 31% saying don't know. So it really is split down the middle, which I think is, I mean, we've talked about it internally, and it is a really, really difficult one to call at the moment. So it will be interesting to see what happens this afternoon and in the coming weeks. Okay, so that's the UK's preferred option. What we'll do now is we'll move on to what happens if the UK is outside the customs union and doesn't obtain any of its preferred options. So, and that the government's current position is no customs union, which prevents the UK entering into its own free trade agreement. So if there was no agreement with the EU, that would allow the UK to enter into these arrangements. But that in itself is not without problems. So as we said earlier, all the free trade agreements that the UK has been involved in over recent years have been negotiated by the EU because it does it collectively on behalf of the whole union. So the UK doesn't have recent experience of negotiating free trade agreements, and there's questions as to whether it's got the necessary expertise in order to be able to do that going forwards. There's also the issue that they can take a long time to negotiate. So as I mentioned earlier, CETA took 7 years, deal with Mexico took 2. So it's not a straightforward issue, and it's going to take some time in order to be able to negotiate these free trade deals. So if we don't get any agreement with the EU, effectively we'll be treated as a third country. So there's been lots of talk about what happens if we fall out. We would default to WTO, World Trade Organization rules, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. So there's been lots of commentary on this. An interesting quote came from the former WTO Director General, who said that falling into the WTO rules is not an apocalypse, but will not be as good as a free trade agreement. So it's recognised that there are going to be issues if we fall into a WTO agreement. So the way that would work is tariffs are based on a most favoured nation principle, which is designed to ensure equality of treatment. And what it allows is the UK to set tariffs at the levels that it wants to. So it could have them lower than at present to reduce costs of goods to the UK consumer, but generally it couldn't have them higher because the way that the EU works is that they're normally already at the highest level, so there'd be no difference between what happens at the moment and what happens in the future in terms of increasing tariffs. So VAT, customs duty, border checks and declarations are all going to be an element going forward. So we've talked about VAT and customs duty. Border checks are really interesting because it sounds like it's very simple. You just go through a border, your goods get checked. But according to the OECD, they could add 10% to the cost of goods. And crucially, they could also add delay. So within the EU, we're used to a culture where delivery can be very, very quick. So next day delivery across Europe is a reality for many businesses. And lots of businesses will have built their processes and their supply chain on that. So if goods have to go through a customs check, there could be serious problems to supply chains, which are used to goods being able to flow very quickly throughout the EU. The other non-tariff barriers is in relation to declarations as well. So if you have to complete a declaration, that's going to add additional cost. There is much more digitization of this, but it's still going to create additional costs, not least the need to have to classify your goods. So at the moment, you need to give goods a classification for Interest Act purposes, but that doesn't have any financial consequence. Going forwards, if goods are moving between the EU and the UK, you have to classify to determine what level of duty is payable. So it's crucial that you get the right commodity code. So there's lots of issues if the UK is outside of the customs union. So we're going to finish with another poll, which is, do you foresee difficulties for your business if the UK is outside of the existing customs area and VAT system? I think this one might be slightly more in favour of one answer than the last one. Okay, so we'll close that. So thank you for that. So 83% of you have said yes, which I think is, there are significant issues if we're outside of some sort of union for the reasons that we've just explained. So that's me finished. So we're now going to move on to some questions. So there's a facility within the webinar for you to ask some questions. So if you'd like to ask anything that you like, please feel free to do so. We'll endeavour to answer as many as we can this afternoon. But if there are things which we don't have time to do, we can contact you afterwards. So Nick will start with one of the questions that we've had already.
Okay, we've had some good and interesting ones. The first being there's a distant seller, we think based in the United Kingdom, asking whether they'd be able to avoid the VAT implications of Brexit by using a warehouse in Germany, which is a very interesting question because, of course, e-commerce is an area that we know the UK government is very worried about what the impact of Brexit might be. So I'm going to hand over to my colleagues.
Yeah, I'll take this one. So obviously distant sales at the moment, so this is goods supplied cross-border on a B2C basis, and at the moment they're subject to VAT in the country of dispatch until the distant sales threshold is exceeded, and once it's exceeded it becomes subject to VAT in the country of arrival. So in effect, by having a warehouse in Germany, as we said during the VAT part of it, it would mean that you would still be subject to the rules in the EU member states, so the EU VAT directive. And actually, any goods then delivered from that German warehouse would be subject to German VAT because goods are taxed at the place where dispatch begins. So yes, it would mitigate to a degree any impact from Brexit, but what it would mean is that you'd have to get registered for VAT in Germany, start accounting for German VAT, but then continue to measure the value of sales made to different member states just to see if the thresholds were exceeded in any of those countries. So I'm just trying to see the next question. I'll pass over to Nick for this one.
Okay, so another question that's come up, very different to the distant sales question, but very topical today. Do you think there may be a remote chance of Northern Ireland remaining in the single market to get over the Irish border issues? Very, very good question. And I personally think the answer is no, because the Democratic Unionist Party has made this an absolute red line. And in fact, there was a statement made by a spokesperson today saying that if they were going to have a different arrangement to the rest of the UK, there may as well be a Corbyn government. And this is important because historically, Jeremy Corbyn is viewed as being very much a supporter of a united Ireland, and the DUP have been looked at as being willing to do just about anything to keep him out of government. So the threat that they're making is if the Tories allow a situation where Northern Ireland stays in the single market and the customs union, they're willing to bring the Conservative government down and risk Corbyn. So yeah, so I think our view is very unlikely that would happen. It would be a constitutional crisis if it did happen. Okay, so Andy is going to pick up on another question.
Okay, so this question is, will the distance selling threshold still exist after Brexit? So they will, as we've said, in relation to sales if the goods are dispatched from a member state, but not if they're being dispatched from the UK. So if it goes from the UK, it's an export from the UK, and it's then an import into the other member states. So the distance selling threshold won't apply any longer, and that ties into the having a warehouse in another member state, because if you do have that, you can then apply the rules within the EU. So it's some of our clients are starting to consider setting up warehouses, because you can still be able to ship the goods directly to your customer without having to complete any declarations, without them having to pay any import VAT. So you can continue to operate the same model as you do at the moment, accounting for that in other member states, but without any of the customs headaches which are going to arise if there is if there is a hard border. So tied in with that, I'll pass you on to Rob to talk about a similar question.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. So the question here is low value consignment relief becoming extinct? And if not, would a UK distant seller still benefit from taking advantage of this relief? So low value consignment relief is an EU rule, and it basically exists to allow certain goods to come from outside the EU into it. And if their value is low enough, then they are not subject to any import duties or import VAT. Probably a lot of people will be aware of this situation happening with the Channel Islands and CDs. So when CDs were more popular, maybe a decade or so ago, but they all used to be sourced via the Channel Islands and then come into the EU in single packages, and that put them underneath the import into the low value consignment relief category, and so there's no import VAT and import duty due on them. It is true that low value consignment relief is one of the proposals the EU have got out to abolish, and so that means that every good coming into the EU will then be subject to VAT and be subject to duties. The reason behind that policy is that a number of countries are going down the route of protecting their domestic suppliers, because obviously a domestic supplier has to charge domestic VAT when someone walks into their shop or it's sold within that country. But if a competitor can sell from overseas without any import VAT, they get a competitive price advantage. So low value consignment relief is meant to be going from the EU. And so that means that, you know, a UK distant seller wouldn't be able to get any advantage from that relief. And what it's probably worth just saying, this is about Brexit, but this is a theme we're seeing across the world in low value consignment reliefs being scrapped. I believe Switzerland's got something in the pipeline, and Australia is making very similar changes with effect from the 1st of July this year as well. So hopefully that's insightful. Andy's going to answer another question now.
Thanks, Rob. So the question is about the business model being mainly based on triangular transactions, but not using the simplification relief, but registering for VAT in several EU member states. And it was specifically about whether that means that fiscal representation is going to be required. So not all member states require fiscal representation, but some do, and quite a lot do. The rules, the way that it applies can differ. Sometimes it's more onerous, and there is the tax authorities in practice pursue fiscal reps, and that then has an impact on how the fiscal reps in the country view their liability. But the principle at the moment, subject to member states making the position simpler, is that UK companies would need to have a fiscal rep in those countries which require them for non-EU companies. So that potentially increases the costs. It might mean that you would want to review how you use triangulation simplification, because the rules normally don't mean that you have to be established in order to use it, but that you need to be VAT registered within the EU. So it might be that you could register in some countries which don't need fiscal reps, and then use the VAT numbers from those countries in order to apply the relief in other countries where you do. So I think it would make sense to analyze current supply chains and then see what the most appropriate structure would be going forwards. So it should be possible to avoid having to register everywhere, but it is a real issue that, I mean, I think some of the discussions that we've had with our partners is that it's not expected that the rules would be specifically different for UK companies, and that ties in with what Rob was talking about with reciprocity for 13th Directive claims. Some countries have a list. If the UK is not on that list, they can't make claims, and it might take some time for the UK to be added to that list. So there are lots of issues potentially where the UK isn't going to have as easy a position in the future as it has in the past. Okay, so I'll pass you back to Rob to take another question.
Hi, thanks, Andy. So question here, if we anticipate a hard Brexit, would the most efficient general rule of thumb advice, cost notwithstanding, be to register in a member state? I think the answer to that has got to be that there is no rule of thumb route that can be taken. So as a general rule, to register in a country for VAT, you either need to be involved in a transaction that makes you obliged to register, so selling some goods or services where you are the party that has to remit the VAT, or you generally have to have an establishment, and that's often got to be an office with some substance from a human and technical perspective that has got the ability to make or receive supplies to then register for VAT as well. So like Andy was saying, it's going to be very much a case of having to look at all the supply chains that you're involved with, checking where you've got obligations to be registered and where you don't at the moment, and whether that means you have to make changes in the future, and then going through that line by line, supply chain by supply chain, to check, do I need any new VAT registrations? Most businesses, the approach is to minimize the number of VAT registrations, but with the UK potentially having a different status, that could mean that there are a number of different VAT registrations needed by businesses. But when you do register for VAT numbers in the EU member states, we see it with our registration team that they get asked a number of questions and they have to justify to the tax authorities why a registration is needed. There's got to be real substance behind everything that you do, and that's got to be evidenced to the tax authority. So very much a case of look at each of the supply chains and then make sure that you can justify what you're doing and that it's just meeting any obligations that are met.
Okay. We've had many questions. I think we're probably coming to the end of the session. I just noticed one. We've been asked if we have a view about what European VAT obligations will look like in general post-Brexit, and I think that probably refers back to the VAT action plan. I think it's very difficult to tell, because there's been a real attempt by the Commission to put together a framework. I mean, they call it the definitive system based on the destination principle, and they've pushed it quite heavily. And the agenda has really been around cutting fraud, but individual member states are quite sceptical about the Commission's real intentions and whether it's really more about harmonisation than fraud prevention. And there's a particular issue about the one-stop shop structure for future VAT regulation. Member states, and I mean the UK, as I said earlier on, the UK has generally been sceptical about this, but Germany in particular is very, very resistant to the idea of tax authorities collecting VAT on each other's behalf. It's been a no-no so far. Now, because tax decision making in the EU is unanimous, it's on the unanimity principle, there will have to be full agreement before any of these major reforms come through. So, I mean, we actually were talking about this amongst ourselves. The general consensus among our consultants is they expect to see some kind of one-stop shop for distance sales potentially, but are very much more sceptical about the larger system. But it will be the UK will have to integrate with this whatever happens. So change, yes, probably in the general VAT system 2021, 2022. I'm a bit more skeptical. I think the Germans will stop it. All right. Well, we'd like to thank everybody who's attended, and also everybody that's asked questions. Our contact details have just come up on screen. We will be in touch with anybody who's asked a question that we've not been able to answer today, and you can follow us and stay up to date with what we're saying about VAT and about Brexit. I fear that we'll be doing Brexit webinars in 5 or 6 years still, as per the way that things have gone with Canada. But yeah, you can follow us on LinkedIn and also at Twitter on the addresses that you see. But thank you very much, and have a lovely afternoon.